Welcome to everyone to Chart Chat. Thanks for joining us and bearing with my enthusiasm for musical theater with our continuation of numbers-themed opening numbers. I'm Amanda Makulec. I am the Executive Director at the Data Visualization Society and Data Viz Lead at Excella, and I'm excited to be hosting this round of Chart Chat around with my three wonderful co-hosts who are the authors of the Big Book of Dashboards and will each introduce themselves individually. Andy, you want to go first?
Yeah, hi everybody. Andy Cotgreave, technical evangelist at Tableau, host of If Data Could Talk, as well as Chart Chat. Nice to be here with you all.
Steve?
Hey, I am Steve Wexler. I'm the founder and principal of Data Revelations, one of the three authors of the Big Book of Dashboards, and author of the newly released, at least in the USA and Canada, book, The Big Picture.
Congrats.
Jeff Shaffer here, Chief Operating Officer and VP of IT and Analytics at a company called Unifund in Cincinnati, Ohio. Also adjunct professor at the University of Cincinnati and co-author of the Big Book of Dashboards. Great to be here with you.
So we are really excited to have, again, a fifth person joining us as our special guest today. Joining us today for Chart Chat is going to be Rosamund Pearce, who you also see on the screen next to us. She is a graphic reporter and data journalist at The Economist, who works on the graphic details section of the paper and other charts and graphs. And Rosamund, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and a bit of your background?
Sure. My name is Rosamund Pearce. I'm a visual data journalist for The Economist. I designed both static and interactive graphics, mainly working in the graphic details section, which is our only section dedicated to data journalism.
And we are really excited because I think we are all big fans of the work we see in The Economist. So getting to into how you actually go about putting together some of the great charts and graphs and features that you have is really exciting to all of us. Roz has picked out a few favorite or interesting charts and graphs for us to dig into today. So we'll be focusing primarily on her work. And as a reminder, this is Chart Chat. More than just chit chat, it's Chart Chat, where we try to dig into some of those process considerations and different ways in which these great visualizations come together. On our agenda today, we are going to spend just a few minutes revisiting a question that came up about the Florence Nightingale chart that we talked about last month. If you missed that session, which also featured our guest, Tim Harford from the Financial Times, you can find that on YouTube, and it was a great conversation, so do dig back into that. So Steve will revisit that conversation for us. Next, we'll go ahead and talk about Roz's different examples, and finally end with our lightning round, where we do a quick discussion on one or two quick little charts. And if you have time afterwards, we welcome you to stay on this webinar. We will stop recording and go ahead and move over to have a delightful conversation about some of the topics that we talked about today, where you are welcome to turn on your mic, turn on your video, and chime in and be part of the conversation. So that is our agenda for the next hour. We're excited to have you all here from around the world. And with that, Steve, I will hand it over to you. Once we go through, and just remind folks that it is okay, especially in the after party, to disagree with us. We encourage disagreement and debate in terms of the ways in which we go ahead and make different data visualization design choices. So as the Big Book of Dashboards authors were putting together their book, a lot of the conversations that they had, they thought were particularly interesting, as they like to remind us at our various different Chart Chat intervals, around the ways in which they didn't always agree on exactly what the different decisions would be around the best fit for a dashboard or a data visualization. So especially if you stick around for the after party or choose to join in the chat box below, feel free to disagree with us, ask questions, and add your voice into the conversation. If you would like to join us next month, the next Chart Chat Live is already scheduled and on the books. It will be Tuesday, June 29th. You'll see we're moving our days of the week a little bit lately if you've been joining us for a while. Still at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and you can already register at bigpic.me-cc23. So with that, I really will hand it over to Steve. Steve, you want to go ahead and revisit our polar area diagram?
Briefly, a discussion came up, which is, well, why is the big one on the right and the small one on the left? So if you'll, I saw a wonderful video from our friend and colleague, Robert Kosara. He had done this wonderful piece dissecting the Charles Minard, Napoleon attempt to conquer Moscow chart. And here's another of these greatly debated, greatly loved historical charts, the Nightingale chart. And I watched the video, and he had an answer for why the before is on the right and why the left, the after, is on the left. And it came from a discussion he had with R.J. Andrews, who's our also friend and colleague and probably one of the great data visualization historians and scholars. But first of all, why does the data start in March? Well, that's the first data that Nightingale had, was from March of 1854. And well, but why start March over to the left like that? And that's because this feeling or belief that, oh, the summer months should be up high and the winter months should be down low. That's how people would just get used to it. The sun is really high, so summer is up top. So that's why you'll see you have June, July, August towards the top. And she's showing a year's worth of data and trying to show, look, huge outbreak of disease the first year, and the second year, there's much less disease. Well, March ends up being all the way over on the left if you go with the summer months being up at the top. So if you want to follow, well, you kind of have to go over to the left. And that's what that dotted line is showing. We leave off in March and then we pick up in April, and all having to do with because decided, well, June and July should be at the top of this circular diagram. So that's why it's going from right to left.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Thanks, Steve. Anyone want to chime in? Andy, Roz, Jeff, with any other feedback or thoughts on the Nightingale chart before we dig into some of the great content Roz has for us today?
I noticed a chart similar to this in this week's Off the Charts newsletter from The Economist. You were talking about polar diagrams. So
Yes.
yeah, so that it all comes back to Roz and The Economist.
Yeah, this is a really strange coincidence that I actually wrote a newsletter about polar charts like this very week, including this very chart, although I didn't actually get like too much into the chart specifically. It was just sort of like mentioned briefly as sort of the history of polar charts. But yeah, obviously, I haven't seen last week's episode, but yeah, clearly there are some issues with it sort of ballooning outwards. Yeah. It makes the
did you write the newsletter this week, Roz?
Yes.
So you did. Did you make those all the charts in the newsletter?
Yes. Yeah.
Nice. Very good. Very good.
There we go.
Have a link for where people can subscribe to that?
I do. I have it on my clipboard. Just bear with me.
So with that, kind of wrapping up our rediscussion on Nightingale, Roz, we're so excited to have you here to chat with us today and to share. We picked out 3 different examples of pieces of your work that we'll be focusing on. We're excited to dig into how they got created, why you maybe made some of the choices you did, and dig into some of the questions we tend to dig into about all those seemingly small design decisions that get made. So with that, I'll hand it over to you to go ahead and share your screen and kick us off with our bubble chart around life expectancy.
Sure. So yeah, this is the first chart I've picked to talk about. This is one of our daily charts, so they're web only, and there's sort of one big chart that an article is based around. And this is a chart showing how male life expectancy compares with female life expectancy. So clearly, in all countries, female life expectancy is higher. That's the main point of the chart. So the article is discussing the reasons why women tend to survive COVID-19 more, and it basically says that it's for the same reasons that women tend to live longer anyway, and sort of digs into that. And yeah, so shout out to Our World in Data, who have a similar chart that was part of the inspiration for this. Actually, if I can find, here we go. Sorry. So yeah, this was part of the inspiration. But in this case, they've labeled, they colored it by continent, which would be really useful if you sort of want to see the geographic variation, because clearly there's a pattern with most of the African countries being in like the bottom section here. But because the article I was designing a chart for was mainly talking about the gap between the sexes rather than sort of where this life expectancy varied, I decided to color it by gap instead, because it's actually a little bit hard to, because it's on a diagonal, it's a little bit, for each bubble you have to kind of add it up in your head. So I thought it would be easier to just color, and then you can see at a glance, for example, that Russia and Lithuania, the gap is over 10 years. Yeah.
So this is another great, simple but effective chart. I had a question just on because this has appeared in the web only. Can you talk about what are the differences between how your charts that you put in the paper, so in the print, to ones that go on the web, and how are they subtly different or majorly different?
So stylistically, we have a different style rules for web charts. So they all have a white background instead of our classic blue background. There's also, so in print charts, we just have a little red tag here, but in web charts, we have a red line running all the way across the top. And we also don't have a border, so that it sort of runs flush with the page, which is why it looks a little bit tight around the edges here.
and you have, I mean, I think everyone, we'd all agree the Economist style is incredibly distinct, right? You know an Economist chart from a mile away. Is that how, as a visual journalist, do you enjoy that constraint, or does it sometimes rub up against it?
I mean, we do have a style guide, but I actually think it is quite flexible. I mean, we have quite a lot of different colors and different like color scales and stuff that you can use. So I don't find it too limiting. So we have a whole load of sort of primary colors that we sort of use preferentially, but then we have like also some secondary colors that if, like the primary colors don't work for a particular reason, we can fall back on them. So for example, like if you're making a line chart of like political parties, you generally want to use the color that is associated with that party, otherwise it could confuse people. So we have secondary colors, and usually that'll be one that matches. Okay,
brilliant. Okay, all right, let's start some specific questions on this one. So the first question I wanted to ask is, why is the y-axis labeled on the right?
So we always do that. That's like just another element of our style. I can't actually remember what the reason for that is now. I think it's so that the first thing you look at isn't the axis. The first thing you look at is the like stuff on the chart, and then you can then interpret it. I think that was the original reasoning behind it.
And actually, to reverse that, and then the last thing you look at is the axis. Is that a similar sort of slightly subtle but same phrasing? It's like, okay, you've seen the data, and now you know what the numbers mean because the eyes move in that direction.
I think also it helps the design to look a bit more balanced. So especially in print where we're quite restricted on space, if you're having the axis label here, if it's on the right, then it's often you can sort of fit them both in and they don't impinge on each other too much. Whereas if this was on the other side, then the whole thing's a bit unbalanced. Everything's on like the left-hand side of the page.
So I think it does subtle, yeah.
Yeah, I think it does help the design to look a bit more balanced.
Seems like you have some freedom in the style guide, by the placement of your legend, your size legend, taking up sort of 4 squares, and your color legend taking up 4 squares, and your y-axis is it's not really an axis, it's kind of on top of the chart on the line. So are those conscious design decisions that you make with each one?
Yeah, so we have a set sort of distance between the x-axis labels and numbers and the label. That's 10 points, and so they're normally 10 points apart, but we are a bit flexible with this, especially because in print often you have to sort of do some clever things to get a chart to fit into the space. So sometimes we might bring this label down here if we're really tight on space, but I do prefer it above. I think it looks a bit less squashed.
I was struck by the same kind of piece around the placement and the balance that it creates to have the two different legends there separated. In terms of the way that you've decided which one goes in that upper left quadrant, was that also a deliberate decision in terms of which one was more important?
Yeah, I mean, population isn't actually that important. It's more just to sort of so you can quickly see which are the important countries. Like, it doesn't actually matter too much for understanding the chart or learning anything more about the piece. So that's kind of secondary. So yeah, I put the color legend first.
I think that's a very important point. I get questions. I tell students in, data viz class, we don't like bubble charts because size is not great for comparisons, but you hit on this is why does it work here? It's because this isn't a viz about population. This is a viz about the gap between the sexes. And this population is really just a sort of a secondary element in there. And it just, provides additional detail for you.
Yeah.
Jeff, speaking of the secondary elements that are there, your decision to color code this by the gap, I think, is really helpful. That yes, you're looking for the dots that are as far away or as close to the line as possible, but Lithuania, Russia, really pop out as they're and Eswatini, as you can't help but see these are so much darker. In terms of the balance of the stuff, were there any discussions about the aspect ratio, like why it's why it's not a perfect square?
Yeah, so for the daily chart, we do actually have a sort of aspect ratio that we try to stick to, just so that the thumbnail on the website, it sort of fits into that. We don't have to, so for some cases we'll change it, but I agree that it actually would have been nice to have the male and female sort of axis lines be square to each other. That would have been nice, but I think in the end it sort of wasn't worth it for the image.
Did you?
Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
I was going to ask, did you consciously play with the Z order of the bubbles? I mean, in some cases, mostly small bubbles on top of large bubbles, but you consciously brought China and India over top of other bubbles that are really hidden and probably not really part of the story that you can't see anymore. So you must have made manual, one-off country decisions here.
Yeah, so I often, when I'm doing a bubble chart, if I remember, I arrange the data so that the smallest data is drawn last in terms of what I'm sizing by bubble. So, and then I bring the ones that I label to the front. So it's sort of smallest first unless they get labeled, which does mean that some are covered up, but I don't think that's a huge problem.
So I've got a couple more questions. Why does some have black borders, white borders, and no borders, or actually do the ones with no borders have white borders and they're just against the black? I think I've just answered my own question. Talk about borders.
The ones that I've labeled, I've given a black outline just so it's clear. Oh, no. For example, in the case of Japan, it might not be obvious which one I was pointing to if it didn't have the outline.
Right.
And then for ones where they're really far away, I've added a little sort of line.
Yeah. Did you try this as a bar chart? Just as a bar chart where the height is the difference, the gap?
I didn't actually. I mean, partly because I'd already seen a really good example from our world in data, so I sort of knew this type would work. But normally I do experiment a bit more with the chart type.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the curved lines. I actually think the curved lines are like those seemingly small things that actually make a really big difference in terms of readability. And I actually noticed your labeling convention with the black circles with Mozambique. When I was just looking at it, I was like, which one is Mozambique? And I think that was a really helpful choice.
I think it helps to have a mix, because if you have if it's all just lines, then it can just end up looking really busy. But yeah, you need that option as well if something's really far away.
One more question. My ignorance, where's Eswatini? I've not heard of that.
That is what used to be Lesotho, I think. They renamed themselves quite recently. I think.
I did not know. Thank you.
Roz, I'm curious about the expectations of your audience. I mean, you know, all four of us who are, you know, enraptured by this, you know, we joke we're professional chart looker-atters, and we have no problems with a scatter plot and the diagonal line and going, oh, here's where parity would be. But is there an understanding or assumption that, yeah, if you're reading this part of The Economist, or you're reading, you know, the web version of The Economist, you get these things? Or is there, or do you think some people are lost with it?
I mean, I do worry about that sometimes, which is why I always try to add like helpful annotations and stuff like that. But yeah, we do assume that the average Economist reader is like knows their way around a chart at least a little bit.
But it's Swaziland, not Lesotho. So the other country.
Oh, sorry, my bad.
The other country that is encompassed. No, it's okay.
Sorry, Swaziland. I misremembered.
So I'm mindful that we have two really kind of rich examples to dig into. I think that because we are professional chart looker-atters, we could probably keep asking questions about this one for an hour, especially Andy, it seems.
Sure.
So if we could, Roz, can we take a look at the next chart that you had brought up from the graphic detail feature from the paper?
Yes. So this is from the print version of The Economist. This is our graphic detail page, which, as I said before, is sort of data journalism page that yeah, we fill every week. This is the map showing where all the, well, not all the victims of the Auschwitz generated, but where the Jewish victims originated from. So there's this museum in Israel called Yad Vashem that have been like collecting loads of data on all the victims, and we discovered that they had, amazingly, they had geographic data on, I can't remember exactly how many it is, but I think it's in here somewhere. I can't see a town. Anyway, hundreds of thousands of Jews, and it has where they came from. So we thought it would be make a really compelling page to yeah, to map this, just because I think, you know, if you didn't know that much about it, you might assume that they were all from nearby, but this goes to show that's really not the case. And yeah, also to go with this, we did this chart basically showing how yeah, there aren't that many Holocaust survivors left, and they're reducing every year. And this is sort of prediction of how many left there will be by sort of 2025, 2030, et cetera, et cetera.
So I noticed that you have the hexagons across the top, which if you zoom in, you can kind of see the hexagonal area. Can you speak more about that decision to use the small hexagons in terms of how this is tiled or what the unit of geography is? Yes, so when I got this data, I noticed that a lot of the addresses that they had for these people were only specific to the level of like the city that they lived in, for example, and there were quite a lot of people from the same city, like Paris here, you can see, and also lots of places in the Netherlands. So, I mean, probably the most obvious way to plot this data would be a bubble map, but then the trouble is, I mean, you might have some really, really big bubbles, but there's also going to be lots like overlapping, especially in like some of the really busy areas. So I didn't want to cover up any of the data. So instead I decided to do a sort of hex bin heat map, which so I thought was quite a nice balance of showing the spread of where everyone came from, but also sort of emphasizing those areas where there are a lot of victims. Yeah, I think it's a very striking map to look at. Colleagues, thoughts or questions on the design choices here from your side?
Can you talk about color choice, Roz? Because I know there's a lot of experimentation with color on the back page.
Yes, so I thought quite a lot about the color choices for this one, probably more than I even do usually, just because I didn't want to sort of, because color conveys emotion. I didn't want to come up with a scheme that felt kind of inappropriate for like the gravity of the subject matter. so we use quite a lot of red, like normally in graphic detail, and like the first thing I tried was a sort of red scale, and it was just completely wrong. It like sort of looked a little bit like a bloody smear, which I just like thought would be really inappropriate. The next thing I tried was a blue one, but eventually I settled on this sort of grayscale thing. I just thought it sort of, yeah, just set the right mood for the subject matter.
Thing that jumps out to me in your work is your annotation layer, right? It's just impressive. Each viz, you put so much information in there, but yet it's not cluttered. It's like you strike a really great balance of giving us lots of information and highlight points, and what Amanda talked about, even the way you draw the lines, everything is with such care, and it moves out of the way of the data. You place your annotations in a way that it doesn't obscure other data. So that's really striking to me. Thank you. Yeah, I was really like also thought quite carefully, because I didn't want to cover up data, because obviously like given the subject matter, each data point's really important. So I like spent quite a lot of time like even with like the borders, I tried to make sure they weren't so thick that it's sort of any one hexagon was covered. Although the one limitation there was that there were like a few victims that were actually from much further afield, because the Yad Vashem database sometimes had the place of birth rather than the place of last residency. So there were even some in like the Philippines and South America and stuff. But unfortunately, to include them, we would have lost a lot of detail on the map. So it was sort of, in the end, I had to make that decision. But yeah, we've got, I thought it was worth making that decision for that.
If I'm reading the bar chart correctly, too, the light shaded end of the bar is the remaining Jewish population from the pre-war population number. So the actual endpoint is the pre-war population, and then you see basically the share that's killed. Was there a deliberate choice around not including a legend or something else there?
I think the title explains that chart enough, but yeah, perhaps the other section could have done with the label. There could be an argument made for that, certainly.
Oh, so I missed this. So the lighter gray is survived or not identified? Okay, survived, got it.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, it is covered in the title, but yeah, perhaps I could have added that. I mean,
so I remember reading this in the paper and reading that bar chart, and particularly since this came out, we've obviously had a pandemic in the field. There's a lot of criticism in the field about the way we aggregate data about people, and that sometimes putting stuff in a bar chart, it's like, well, it hides the reality of the individuals behind the story. But I remember at the time, and I can feel it now, there's something about that Poland bar chart that is pretty emotional, because you can say 3 million Jews were killed in Poland. It's like, well, I can't comprehend 3 million as a number, but when you compare it to the total population, it's just like, it's brutal, really powerful.
Also, another thing to say about this bar chart is that often I like in the Economist, just for issues of space, if we'll shorten like millions just down to 1, 2, 3, and then just put million in the title just to save space. But in this case, I thought actually we've got the space to write out million, and like, why hide it when with this subject matter? It's better to just write it out.
It jumped right out at me when I saw it, just all those zeros. It's just a great use of not shortening it.
Ilya just asks, so the hexagons indicate origins, not deaths. That's correct. So the darker areas are where the Jews lived, lived prior to the war.
And also I should probably note as well, we've got the pre-war borders on here, just because we were talking about where they're from, so we thought that was like the most appropriate borders to use. Luckily, my colleague Evan is quite good with historical data and managed to sort that all out.
How many people work on a chart like this?
So actually, this was just me and Evan did the pre-war borders. So yeah, just 2 of us.
Right.
And can I ask, I think there's a process piece to this in terms of, you're turning around charts like this for publication in a weekly paper. How long are you usually spending on something with this kind of level of density? Looking at, clearly you have two different data sets here, at least in terms of the population and deaths data in the bar chart, plus the additional origin data in the other chart and some complexity.
Yeah.
How long does that take? What does that process look like for each week's graphic detail section?
So, I mean, ideally, it would be nice to have 5 days to work on this. Often that doesn't happen. And it's more like 3 or 4, or occasionally even less. But this one, I think so we go to press on a Thursday and it has to be sort of signed off by Wednesday evening. And I think I got the data for this on Friday. And I hadn't actually made a hex bin map before, so I had to learn how to do that. Luckily, it wasn't too hard in the end. But yeah, I did is like using D3, and yeah. Also, I should probably note with the hex bin map, like I could have made it a lot less. I sort of played around quite a lot with the resolution. So I had sort of bigger hexagons, smaller hexagons, but in the end I thought like it was actually nice to have them really small because you like kept all the detail of like where everyone came from.
It took me a minute to realize it wasn't something that was more like a density map, and I kind of draw out like a point map where each person is a point on it, and then you see the clustering versus recognizing the hexagons, which is where I think the cues you give in the legend around the text and around the shapes is actually really helpful there in terms of just kind of more detailed interpretation of what the map is showing.
Yeah, I did have them as a circle, and then suddenly I was like, actually, why not just do them as a hexagon thing, because that's what I'm talking about.
Roz, I'm wondering, you mentioned that the different iterations that you tried, and I don't know if you have them available now. I don't even know if you can show them now, if you did have them available. But I know I would love to see the process and see the early cuts of these things. You know, my favorite stuff of listening to the Beatles channel, Sirius XM these days, is listening to early versions of these songs and just seeing how they evolved. So if it's possible to get that at some point, I would love to see earlier versions of these things and see how it evolved.
Yeah, I'll see if I can dig it out. I might take a while to find though.
And understood, but and I can't speak for our watchers of this thing, but I have a feeling they'd enjoy seeing the iterations.
Mm-hmm. Someone else asked a great question about kind of, in addition to the designers who are involved in the process, you mentioned yourself and one other designer who worked on the map layer. How many people provide feedback and insight across the different iterations? Like, at what point are you asking someone else, what do you think of this, and am I on the right track?
So there's sort of a more informal process that goes on in the data team, where if we're unsure about it or if we want like early feedback, we'll just sort of show it to other people in the data team, which is like a good way of sort of gauging early on if something's going to work or not. But then formally, like during the editing process, I think like this page will probably get looked at by at least 10 people before it gets published. So yeah, quite a few people in the end, which is a really good way of catching if something doesn't work, because obviously if you've been working on something for ages, it's easy to get tunnel vision and you can't really tell if it works anymore, if it's easily understandable, because you're so familiar with the topic.
Yeah. How you have to do, the team has to do a page of these every week, so 52 pages a year. Now in a business, for most of us sort of lean into a business environment, I just create a bar chart every time I'm asked to make a chart, because I know that's the most effective way of doing things. But if you made 52 bar charts on this page, your editors would probably be like, "Yeah, thanks, team, we're out." How do you kind of keep it fresh and keep the visual appeal different each week?
So we do think about when we're deciding whether or not to like do a topic of whether or not it's going to be visually appealing. So occasionally things will make it through where it's like a really interesting story and it might be some simpler charts, but it's sort of worth it for the story. But we do try to think about, we call it holding the page, whether or not it's visually arresting enough. So yeah, I mean, it does happen sometimes where we, end up with quite a few line charts. But like, if that's the best way of doing it, then
Roz, we're getting people asking the tool set for this, and I think your general tool set for what are the arrows in your quiver?
So the main things I use, so we have an in-house chart tool that we use for like simpler bar and line charts. Then for anything a bit more complicated, I tend to use ggplot in RStudio. Yeah, just because there's a bit more flexibility, although it's a bit more effort to style up because you have to sort of do it all from scratch. Then for anything that's sort of not covered by that, I'll use D3 for. So for any sort of force layouts or Sankey's or hex bin maps, anything like that, I'll tend to do in D3. And we use QGIS for making maps. So I think with this one, I actually didn't use QGIS for this. I think I just did this in D3 because you can map in D3 as well. And then brought it into Adobe Illustrator to sort of tidy up and stuff.
And someone else asked, Josh asked, do the hexagons fit together perfectly, which I'm going to guess yes. But then how did you determine the arrangement of the hexagons relative to the underlying location data? You experimented with different sizes and different bins and things. What did that look like? So the actual like location of the hexagons and all of that is actually just decided by like the tool I was using. But then you can just sort of tweak things like the size and stuff. So I didn't actually, I don't program like where they are. I mean, maybe you can, I didn't look into it. Yeah. I'm always struck in reading these kind of sections around the ways in which your team actually weaves in additional data points or information into the narrative that goes with each of these charts. I mean, there's so much richness in the chart itself. And then if you go down and read through the narrative and the pieces at the bottom, I know I was really struck by kind of the quantification around, what was the sentence? Of the 6 million who were murdered, if you spent 5 minutes reading about each of them, it would fill every waking hour for 90 years. And those kind of ways of quantifying information, I think you all do a really nice job on. Well, we're down here at the bottom. Can we talk a little bit about this area chart that you have at the bottom and just the decision to call that out here in this space versus embedding it up in the additional section at the top?
Sure. I think that was partly because it's sort of like a sort of secondary, like often we order the charts in terms of like the order that we want them to be thought about, and that sort of reflects the order of the piece. So sort of, I think this is talked about nearer to the end of the piece, although I can't actually remember off the top of my head. And also it's just partly a spacing thing. So if you've got sort of one big 3-column element, I managed to fit this in sort of using like the white space of Europe, but it would have been a bit of a struggle. I mean, I guess I could have put it here, but again, I was quite reluctant to cover up data. So it's just like a handy other place to put stuff if you've just got a small extra chart.
And it's a different set of data in terms of the geographic mapping, if I read it correctly, right? But it's their current location versus where they come from. Yeah, this is like living group. Yeah, sorry, living Holocaust survivors and a model of sort of how we need to sort of record their testimonies. I'm never going to miss the fact that you have the right aligned y-axes in your style guides now that I'm reading these. I notice them occasionally, and now I'm going to notice this on every single line or bar chart that I read in the Economist. It is occasionally the other way around, and for bar charts we have like the bar labels on the left, but yeah, otherwise it is on the right. I like it a lot. All right. Well, with that, Roz, why don't we go ahead and move on to your last chart that you had shown us, which takes a little bit of a different approach in terms of the kind of chart that it is, and talk through this chart about COVID-19 mutations that you're leveraging. It sounds like your past experience and knowledge around evolutionary biology. Yes, so my undergraduate degree, I also took modules in virology and evolutionary genetics. So this topic happened to be right up my street. This piece is about, it's actually a few months out of date now, but it's about how different concerning mutations in the SARS-CoV-2 virus arose at different points, So for example, this variant here and this variant here both have the E484K mutation, but their common ancestor doesn't have it. The main point of the chart was to show that, but also we just sort of wanted to show the sort of main different strains at the time and which mutations they had and where some of the important ones were from. I have an undergrad degree in zoology and a master's in public health, and so this is my happy nerdy chart of the three that you've shared. And I think it's a wonderfully simple way of displaying really complicated information, which I applaud you for. I've seen other more, let's just call them academic graphs that attempt to plot similar information, but are far harder to follow in terms of the flow. Can you talk about some of the editing down you did? Because I know if you look at the footnote down at the bottom, you're looking at 36 of 880 lineages. So can you talk a bit about that editing process?
Yes. So yeah, one of the things about designing for print is that you have to edit down it with like a massive data set like this, because you can't show it all in one go, otherwise it's going to look completely crazy. So we just picked like the top 36 lineages, which accounts for about 70% of all sample sequence. So this is quite a good picture overall of like the sequences at the time, but obviously it's missing a few. But for example, if you look here, so they're named by they're named sequentially. So this is like branch 318 of this one. So there would have been like, I would have had to have shown like 300 things here, which obviously I didn't have space for. So we edited it down a bit, and also didn't actually show the like places for all of them, because it's sort of hard to squeeze that in, and also don't want to overload the chart with information. And also a lot of the ones that I saw in scientific papers had evolutionary distance encoded into the family tree, so that's called a phylogenetic tree, but decided not to try and do that, just thought it would be a bit ambitious, and I was also not sure that everybody who wasn't an evolutionary geneticist would get it. The main thing was to show the relationships between the different strains.
Can you talk a little bit about the visual encodings you decided on? I mean, you have a legend up there in the upper left that has your different colors as well as some shapes. And I think this is just such a good example of the ways in which the ways we encode information on quantitative charts and graphs. We can actually think in a lot of the same ways around shape and color and position when we're building out frameworks or other more qualitative visualizations. So can you talk through that process a bit?
Sure. I think I was inspired, without really actually thinking about it, by those sort of family trees where you have like it sort of plots mutations and like recessive genes and stuff. I think I was inspired by that for this. So yeah, I decided to just add a little square for ones with these significant mutations, but have it as a sort of half square for if it was only a few types of that variant that had it. And we've also outlined variants of concern as well.
Mm-hmm. I could continue asking questions for days about this, but colleagues, any questions from you about some of the other design choices here?
Just, I've got a question about the position of the data source information. Now that's inside the bottom line of the bottom right part of the chart.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a deliberate decision, or is it just the way you design it in Photoshop, in Illustrator? Is it a way to ensure the data sources go with the chart if it gets copy and pasted elsewhere? Or am I overthinking things?
I've not really actually thought about that before. We always like have the source there. I guess so it's immediately to hand. I mean, I guess we could put it at the bottom, but yeah, it's nice to have it next to what it relates to. Normally we put it on the bottom right hand side, just because I think it can look a bit ugly if it's too close to the title here.
Mm-hmm.
But I broke that rule here because it just made so much more sense for the tree to kind of flow from the top left, which is where your eye lands when you look on the page, and then to go to the bottom right. I actually tried like reversing like them a bit to try and get it to end here, but it just sort of didn't look as good than it did just sort of having it sort of flowing this way.
It's fascinating. I think a general lesson for people watching that you've just said, but you've said throughout this episode, is how it's fine to break your guidelines, right? You know, you might have your style guide or your best practice rules, but as long as when you break them, you've done it with a reason and a justification, it's fine, right? And I think it's just amazing hearing how many times you've sort of described that process to cut that across. So it's great.
Yeah, I think because like every week is so different, like you can't sort of be too hard and fast with what you're doing. And compared to the other sections of the paper, we are a bit more flexible with the style of this one. So we do experiment a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
I was fascinated that you included the spike protein gene mismatch coding up in the upper right. Why put that there? What is a lay reader of The Economist going to take away from this? What was the rationale for including that visual?
Well, I think I suggested this partly because I just thought it's nice to just have an example of like what the mutation is. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, to somebody who doesn't necessarily know what that is. So just to show it's like merely one base pair change that can have like a huge effect.
And I love that. And I love that you can get, this is this huge long string, and we're only seeing this little part of it. The little fading at the beginning of the string and the fading at the end of the string is really well done. But now now I get a sense of, what a variant is. It's just one letter, one item, one acid that's different for constructing this protein.
Well,
yeah, I mean, I
have a number key, right? That you get the key on the position piece there, yes, in terms of connecting the dots between what I'm reading on the left over to what that functionally means in practice.
Yeah, I included that, like that specifically, and also the brackets E brackets K, because it basically explains the name for the mutation. But I haven't like explicitly talked about that, but I thought sort of observant readers would notice that.
I love the Easter eggs. Is it Easter eggs for observant readers? That's what these are.
I just wanted to mention your pinned tweet. You have a great article on breaking the rules, in DataViz on Medium. I put a link in the chat, but I think that's a great discussion. Somebody else also asked a question. Do you start with the story first and then the visuals to enhance the story, or do you find nuggets first and then write the story?
So I don't actually write the stories. Sort of in this section, every page is worked on by a data journalist and a visual data journalist. So I sort of I do the image while they write and research the piece. And so often it will start more with an idea and a data set, and then they'll work with me to sort of find a visual that works. But occasionally it works the other way around. So it's not hard and fast. Occasionally we'll sort of think of something that or see a sort of version of something that we think we could make a really great visual from, and then we write a story from that. So for example, for our climate change issue, we basically 2 years ago, we did a whole edition of The Economist sort of dedicated to climate change. And for that, I had this idea that we could, basically map Arctic sea ice minimums, and the sort of story came backwards from there.
Yeah, I'm always amazed by just the richness that you managed to pack into one set of summary graphics. I know the one we haven't talked about on here is the sequences with mutation piece. You're on a log scale on your y-axis. Can you talk a little bit about that choice, or kind of why you decided to use that in this context?
Yes. I did actually try not plotting it on a log scale, but then it was really hard to see the sort of early variation in the sequences. There's arguments for doing it both ways, but basically plotting it on a log scale allows you to see what's going on over here. Otherwise, it's basically just sort of nothing shoots up. And I wanted to sort of show, how they sort
and John Burt Murdoch talked about that a lot when he was doing his early COVID charts last year as well, that that there is the way to show the trends, there's the right things to do, but then there is also the way you use the visual space. So another great choice.
Yeah, there's definitely arguments for both, and it kind of depends on the story you want to tell. But I just didn't want to give the impression that there were like none before, which it probably would have done.
I know accessibility has been a big conversation, I feel like, in the DataViz community, especially this year. And I mean, this is one example where we have information encoded, the two different mutations, just solely by color with the orange and the blue. Is that something that you spend a lot of time thinking about, or have guidelines that you follow internally on ensuring that these charts are accessible to folks with varying different ability to see the differences in those colors?
Yeah, we do have chart guidelines, and we try not to use, for example, like red and green, because that can affect color blindness. Also, just through like getting a lot of people to look at it, that's often quite a good test of, because of people of all ages, that's quite a good test of like, can you actually understand it? But in general, I think I am quite keen on using quite contrasting colors where possible, just so that it's sort of at a glance you can like pick up what's going on.
My immediate kind of, when you talked about emotion with color related to the Holocaust map, and my immediate thought when I saw this one was, should I be more worried about the orange mutation than the blue mutation?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not like an expert, but I think it was a more worrying mutation at the time. I'm not like sure what exactly is happening now. I'm sure there are some worse ones since. I haven't really kept up with it. Yeah. But I just tried to use two like bright colors. But yeah, there's not particularly any meaning in the orange.
I had a question just on the chart types that, we've seen. We started with a scatter plot that has, size. Then we went to a map that uses hex. Now we're looking at a node link diagram that has a log scale. You mentioned sane keys and other things. Have you felt in the design over the last, few years that the graphs are becoming more sophisticated, that the reader's understanding of these graph types are more sophisticated?
So quite a good example of that is like a smoothing line and a scatter. Like 5 or maybe slightly longer years ago, we used to always label the trend line and to say trend line, but now basically most of our readers are familiar with what a trend line on a scatter is. So we've actually stopped labeling that because we think our readers are more familiar with it. So basically, yeah, as we as our charts develop, and they do, we sort of keep tabs on what our readers understand.
Perfect.
I just want to just point out my appreciation for very subtle, small things that in this. Jeff pointed out how great the annotation layer was in this and the other charts. Just the use of a little rule to point out, well, here's where the heading is. Now you've got a full rule above the title there, evolutionary pressure, but then the other things, these small things that will draw attention, but not too much. And I just appreciate the subtle things to help me kind of navigate here are the delineation points amongst these different parts of the chart. Effective use of white space, but just that little tiny rule there. Rather than a full line or graying this thing out, etc., is helping guide me tremendously.
Tim asked the question, how do you judge how well your readers read the charts? Or maybe a related question, how do you know if something is more successful than something else? Do you have measures for those sorts of things?
We did do, when we first launched the graphic details section, because it was all still quite an experiment and we were doing lots of like really unique and interesting charts. We did do a reader survey, and I think we then did pare back a little bit on experimentation because there were some that some readers, like not all readers understood, so we tried to be a little bit more cautious after that. This was before I joined, so I don't know as much about that.
Well, I mean, we are all, I think, in awe of and greatly appreciate you walking through all of the ways in which we've made these different design decisions, Roz. This has been fascinating. We are going to go ahead and start to wrap up for our day. Jeff, I know you had one lightning round option that you wanted to share with us. I'm going to go ahead and pull up your screen and share your lightning round.
I will do that. Yeah, the lightning round comes from my screen sharing. Can you see Twitter?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this comes from Ethan Hahn sent this to me this week. Sam Lerner created a river flow project using Mapbox. He published this. You can follow him on Twitter. It's an interactive map where you basically pick a location. You can zoom into anywhere. I'll just go into Cincinnati. But what's fun about this is once you find a location in Cincinnati, here I'll just take Owl's Nest Park and I'll click on it. What it'll do is find the path of where the water, if rain were to drain, through the system, it would go down at that location in the United States. It would go down the Ohio River, and it just follows the map of water flow from any point in the United States through this really detailed map. you can go into more detail with a slider that brings you down, really slow, and you can follow the path, or you can go into sort of this high level detail that looks at it more, at a county or state level. But it's really cool. If you're up north, things flow to the Great Lakes. If you're down south, they'll flow to the rivers and ultimately to the ocean, and in this case, the Gulf of Mexico. So I thought that was really cool. Let you play with it. But Sam Lerner published that recently on Twitter here. So I'll post a link to that.
Very cool.
That's the kind of thing that I would lose about a day playing with. Thanks, Jeff.
There you go. All that free time you have, Andy.
I have no free time.
So as we go ahead and we wrap up today, we always like to share a couple of things happening across us and our group of folks coming up soon. So Big Book of Dashboards, folks, what do you have on deck for the next month or two?
I've got one. If Data Could Talk, season 2 is launching soon. We've got Jessica from COVID Tracking Project coming up, followed by me interviewing Jeff Engelstein, one of the world's leading board game academics and designers, talking about what what board games teach us about data visualization. Keep your eye out for If Data Could Talk.
And you can always find the recordings for Chart Chat linked on the Big Book of Dashboards website. So make sure you check there or check YouTube to go ahead and find recordings like these. And Steve, you wrote a book.
Yes. The Big Picture is now available. You can go to bigpic.me, and thank you, Andy, for holding that up. That will go to the books page at Data Revelations, where you could read both about the big picture, download a sample of it. Also, you can download a sample of and read about the Big Book of Dashboards, book that I got to write with Andy and Jeff. And by the way, there's a huge price drop on Amazon for the Big Book of Dashboards. So if you're looking for a gift for a friend or colleague, please consider it.
If you are also looking for a great book to use for your team's data visualization book club, the Big Book of Dashboards, I have found, is an excellent book to use for that, where you can talk about all of those various different dashboards. And we've been doing that with my team for 2 to 3 dashboards at a time each week, and it is delightful. So thanks for the great resource, guys. You are welcome to stick around for today's after party. Well, sorry, Steve, I forgot to take away our unvalidated data there. We won't worry about that today. We'll check in on those stats next month. Next Chart Chat Live, in case you missed it at the beginning, is Tuesday, June 29th at 11 a.m. You can register now at bigpic.me/cc23. So we hope that you'll choose to join us live again. And if you so choose, you are welcome to stick around for our after party, where we will go ahead and promote anyone who wants to stay up to being a co-panelist with us. You can unmute your mic, you can share your video if you so choose, and you can join the conversation beyond the chat box. So we hope that you'll stick around and join us for that, given the richness of all of these great examples. So Roz, thank you so much for your time today and for being such a wonderful guest and sharing all of these examples and going through all of our really nitty-gritty questions. I know there are questions we did not get to in the chat that people were asking, so lots of interest in your work and your process.
Great. Well, I should be able to stick around for a little bit, although it is a Wednesday, so we'll go at The Economist today.
Outstanding. And in your copious free time, if we could see some of those early versions of stuff, it's really exciting to see how these things. Sorry to be burdening you with more stuff. I'm going to stop. I'm going to turn the recorder off.
Before you turn the YouTube off, we'll say thank you to everybody for an official end, and hang on if you want to join. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.